24 years with the company, and it ends with your CEO calling you dead weight in front of the entire executive team. But here's the thing about dead weight. Sometimes it's the anchor that keeps the whole ship from sinking. I'm Thomas Wallace, Tom to most people, and until about 6 months ago, I was the Chief Financial Officer at Apex Technologies. 52 years old, built that company's financial foundation from the ground up. Guided them through 3 recessions, 2 major acquisitions, and more market crashes than I care to count. But none of that mattered when Brian Hutchinson decided I was standing in the way of his $3.8 billion empire. The meeting that ended my career started like any other quarterly board review. Glass conference room on the 28th floor in downtown Chicago, polished oak table, leather chairs that cost more than most people make in a month. I walked in with my usual stack of financial reports, risk assessments, and compliance checklists. Years of experience had taught me to always come prepared. Brian was already there, of course, holding court with a few board members. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up. That I'm a man of the people look he'd perfected since taking over from his father 3 years ago. The agenda was supposed to be routine. Q3 numbers, budget projections for next year, maybe some discussion about the Atlantic Technologies acquisition that had been floating around for months. What I got was an ambush. Before we dive into the quarterly reports, Brian announced once everyone was seated, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room." His eyes found mine across that polished table. Tom has become a bottleneck. His old-school approach to risk management is killing our growth potential. 8 board members suddenly found their coffee cups very interesting. "The Atlantic deal should have closed 6 months ago," Brian continued, warming up to his theme. "But Tom here keeps finding new reasons to delay. More studies, more reports, more analysis paralysis." He leaned forward, his voice getting sharper. Tom has lost his edge, playing it too safe, blocking progress. Maybe it's time for younger blood to handle the big deals. I sat there, pen in hand, watching my career get dissected in real time. 24 years of keeping this company profitable, and I'm getting lectured about being too cautious. The same caution that saved us millions during the dot-com crash. The same analysis that kept us out of the subprime mortgage disaster that killed half our competitors. "Brian," I said, keeping my voice level, "the Atlantic acquisition has legitimate due diligence issues That's exactly what I'm talking about," he cut me off. "Everything's an issue with you. Every opportunity becomes a problem to solve." He gestured to the board members like they were jury members. "We need leaders who see solutions, not obstacles." The room was dead quiet. I glanced around the table at faces I'd known for years. Patricia Morrison, who joined the board 3 years ago, was staring at her notepad. Jonathan Pierce from our biggest institutional investor was checking his phone. Nobody was making eye contact. Then Brian delivered the knockout punch. "I've made my decision. Thomas Wallace is no longer Chief Financial Officer of Apex Technologies, effective immediately. 24 years. And it ends with a sentence that took 5 seconds to deliver. I looked around that table one more time. These people had trusted me with their company's financial future for over 2 decades. I'd made them rich, kept them out of trouble, built the systems that turned their startup dreams into a Fortune 500 reality, and not one of them said a word in my defense. So I did what you do in situations like this. I gathered my papers, stood up, and walked toward the door, professional to the end. "Tom," Brian called after me, his voice softer now, probably realizing how brutal he'd just been. "This isn't personal, it's just business." I paused at the door and looked back at him. "Brian, everything about business is personal. You just never learned that. But here's what nobody in that room knew, including Brian." As I walked past their shocked faces, past the corporate artwork and motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, I was carrying knowledge that would bring his entire empire crashing down. And the beautiful part? He'd handed me the weapon himself 2 years earlier. Let me back up and tell you how this really started. Because the best revenge stories always begin with the target digging his own grave. 2 years ago, Brian came to me with the Atlantic Technologies deal. He was practically vibrating with excitement, talking about market domination, crushing the competition, making Apex the undisputed leader in our sector. Classic Brian. Big vision, bigger ego, zero patience for details. The numbers looked solid on paper, I'll give him that. Atlantic was a tech company with good revenue streams and decent growth projections. But I've been in finance long enough to know that paper doesn't tell the whole story. During my initial review, I found some concerning liability issues, nothing deal-breaking, but enough to raise red flags. Environmental compliance problems at their manufacturing facilities, some questionable accounting practices in their international divisions, a few lawsuits that hadn't been properly disclosed. Standard due diligence stuff, really. The kind of issues that experienced CFOs catch before they become expensive problems. "We don't have time for deep investigations," Brian snapped when I brought up my concerns. "Our competitors are circling. If we don't move fast, someone else will snap them up." This was classic Brian Hutchinson. Rush first, worry about consequences later. I'd watched him operate this way since he was an intern I mentored 15 years ago. And it usually worked out because I was there in the background, catching the falling pieces, cleaning up the messes, making his aggressive strategies actually work. But this time felt different. The stakes were bigger, the risks more complex, and Brian was more impatient than I'd ever seen him, so I did what any good CFO would do. I built myself an insurance policy. It was a simple clause buried deep in the legal framework of the deal. Section 14, subsection C, page 47 of a 200-page document. Easy to miss if you're the type of executive who signs things without reading them, which, let's be honest, Brian absolutely was. The clause read, "Final authorization for any acquisition exceeding $1 billion requires counter-signature from the Chief Financial Officer, ensuring fiduciary responsibility to shareholders and regulatory compliance." Sounds boring, right? Corporate legalese that most people would skim right over. But those 23 words were about to become the most important sentence Brian Hutchinson ever ignored. The night I drafted that clause, we were in the conference room until almost midnight. Empty coffee cups everywhere, legal documents scattered across the table like confetti. Most of the executives had already gone home, but Brian was still there, pacing behind my chair, his patience wearing thinner by the hour. "We don't need more delays, Tom," he kept saying. "Our competitors are circling. We need this framework signed before morning." I kept my eyes on my laptop screen, typing and retyping the language until it was exactly right. 24 years in corporate finance had taught me that the devil lives in the details, and sometimes, if you're smart about it, you can make the devil work for you. When I finally slid the draft across the table, Brian barely glanced at it. He was already mentally celebrating his victory, probably thinking about the press conference he'd hold to announce the deal. "This looks fine," he muttered, flipping through pages faster than anyone could actually read them. "Print it." Daniel Pierce, one of our junior lawyers, leaned forward and squinted at the document. "Excuse me, this clause in Section 14, it places final authority with the CFO. That seems unusual." "Enough," Brian cut him off, his voice sharp as glass. "We don't have time for theory lessons. Just get the signatures we need." I watched Brian's face as he signed that document. No hesitation, no questions. He thought I was just another rubber stamp in his corporate machine. But I knew something he didn't. Someday, maybe someday soon, this clause would matter. Fast forward, 2 years. The Atlantic deal was back on the table, bigger and more aggressive than ever. Market conditions were perfect. Brian's ego was at an all-time high, and he'd spent the last 6 months telling investors this merger would make Apex the dominant player in our sector. The stock price had already jumped 15% just on rumors of the acquisition. Financial journalists were calling it the deal of the decade. Brian was being featured on magazine covers as CEO of the year. Everything was going exactly according to his master plan. There was just one tiny problem. The guy whose signature he needed to close the deal was the same guy he just fired for being dead weight. Walking back to my office after that boardroom execution felt like walking through a different company. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Conversations stopped when I appeared. People suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. I wasn't their respected CFO anymore. I was radioactive. Rebecca Taylor from HR was waiting by my desk. She had that carefully neutral expression HR people perfect over years of delivering bad news to people who used to matter. "You'll need to clear your things today," she said, gesturing to a cardboard box sitting on my chair. "I'll supervise the packing process. Supervise, like I might steal the staplers or download secret files. 24 years of building this company's financial systems, and now I needed supervision to pack my family photos." I nodded and started gathering my professional life into that box. My MBA diploma from Northwestern, a photo from the company's IPO celebration 12 years ago, my CPA certification, a coffee mug from a risk management conference that nobody remembers. As I cleaned out my desk drawers, my fingers hit something thick wedged against the back panel. I pulled it out, a glossy binder with merger agreement draft, Apex Atlantic acquisition printed across the cover. My heart started beating faster. I flipped through the familiar sections until I found page 47, section 14, subsection C. And there it was, the line that would change everything. Countersignature, Chief Financial Officer Thomas Wallace. The space next to my name was completely blank. Rebecca was busy checking her phone, probably coordinating with security about when to escort me out. She wasn't paying attention to what I was packing. I slipped the binder back under some old quarterly reports and closed the drawer. For the first time since Brian's public execution, I smiled. Really smiled. You know what they say about the best laid plans? Sometimes they work exactly the way you designed them to, even when you're not trying to use them. Sometimes the safety net you built years ago becomes the rope your enemy hangs himself with. I finished packing in silence, loaded the box into my arms, and walked out of Apex Technologies for what I thought would be the last time. But as I pushed through those glass doors into the parking garage, I wasn't thinking about endings. I was thinking about beginnings. Because somewhere in that box, hidden under old expense reports and forgotten memos, was a legal document that gave me more power over Brian Hutchinson's future than he could possibly imagine. The same document he had signed without reading, the same clause he dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense. The drive home gave me time to think. 24 years with one company is a long time in today's economy. Most of my peers had job-hopped their way up the corporate ladder, chasing bigger titles and better stock options. But I'd stayed loyal to Apex, believed in building something lasting, trusted that dedication would be rewarded. I'd guided them through the dot-com crash when half our competitors went bankrupt. I'd restructured our debt during the 2008 financial crisis when credit markets froze solid. I'd built the compliance systems that kept us out of the regulatory nightmares that destroyed companies like Enron and WorldCom. And my reward? Getting called deadweight by a CEO whose biggest qualification was inheriting his father's venture capital connections. But here's what Brian never understood about finance guys like me. We don't just manage numbers, we manage risk. And the biggest risk to any company isn't market volatility or competitive pressure. It's arrogant leadership that stops listening to the people who actually know how the machine works. That night, I sat in my kitchen and opened the binder. Every page was exactly as I remembered it. Every clause was still legally binding. And that blank line next to my name, it was still blank. The beautiful irony was perfect. Brian thought firing me solved his problem. What he'd actually done was hand me the keys to his entire empire. The next morning, my phone started ringing at 7:30 a.m. I was still in my bathrobe, making coffee and trying to adjust to the strange reality of having nowhere to be. 24 years of corporate routine, and suddenly, I'm unemployed on a Tuesday. The first call was from Patterson, Wright & Associates, the law firm handling the Apex Atlantic merger. The voice on the other end was polite but urgent. Mr. Wallace, this is Jennifer Walsh from Patterson, Wright. We need to schedule a meeting to complete the final authorization paperwork. The regulatory deadline is Friday. I let it go to voicemail. By 9:00 a.m., 3 more calls. By lunch, 7, each one a little more desperate than the last. Tom, this is Tom Patterson himself. We understand there have been some organizational changes, but the legal framework still requires your signature. Please call me back immediately. The beautiful thing about being fired is that suddenly you have all the time in the world to think clearly. No meetings, no deadlines, no Brian Hutchinson breathing down your neck about quarterly projections. Just you, your coffee, and the slow realization that maybe losing your job isn't the worst thing that could happen. Around 2:00 p.m., my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. International area code. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Mr. Wallace, this is Jonathan Pierce from Northridge Capital. I sat up straighter. Northridge managed over $400 billion in pension funds and institutional investments. When they called, smart people answered. Mr. Pierce, what can I do for you? I'll be direct, Tom. Our analysts have been reviewing the Atlantic acquisition structure. We understand you hold the required counter-signature for final approval. That's correct. Given recent developments at Apex, we wanted to understand your current position on this transaction. I leaned back in my kitchen chair looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere in one of those glass towers, Brian was probably pacing his office, demanding updates from lawyers who had no updates to give. "What's your analysis of the deal, Mr. Pierce?" "Our due diligence team has identified several risk factors that concern us. Environmental liabilities at Atlantic's manufacturing sites, some irregular accounting practices in their overseas operations, a few regulatory issues that haven't been fully disclosed. The same issues I'd flagged 2 years ago. The same concerns Brian had dismissed as analysis paralysis. Those issues are still unresolved," I said. "We suspected as much. Tom, I'll be frank with you. If this merger proceeds without proper due diligence, Northridge will likely exit our position in Apex entirely. We're talking about a $300 million investment." After Pierce hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about irony. Brian had fired me for being too cautious about a deal that his biggest investor was now questioning. The same caution he called dead weight was exactly what smart money appreciated. Day 2 brought more calls, more emails, more desperate attempts to locate the missing CFO signature, but it also brought something else. News coverage. Apex Technologies faces unexpected delay in major acquisition. The financial press had picked up the story, not the full story. They didn't know about the firing yet, but enough to start asking questions. The stock price wobbled. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of uncertainty that makes institutional investors nervous. Day 3 was when things got interesting. My phone rang at 6 o'clock a.m. Brian Hutchinson himself, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Tom, we need to talk. This delay is creating unnecessary uncertainty in the market." I let him talk for 2 minutes about professional obligations and fiduciary duty to shareholders before I finally responded. "Brian, I think you fired me for being too cautious about this exact deal. Look, maybe I was hasty yesterday. The board was pressuring me to move faster, and I took that frustration out on you. That wasn't fair. Hasty. 24 years of building his company's financial foundation, and my termination was hasty. What exactly are you asking me to do, Brian?" "Sign the authorization. Complete the merger. Then we can discuss your future with the company." "My future? I thought I was dead weight." The line went quiet for 10 seconds. "Tom, please don't let ego destroy what we've built together." Ego? The guy who'd publicly humiliated me was lecturing me about ego. "I'll consider it," I said, and hung up. But I'd already made my decision. Not out of anger or revenge, though I'd be lying if I said those feelings weren't there. I made it because 24 years of experience had taught me something simple. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. Brian had shown me that loyalty meant nothing to him. That experience was a liability, not an asset. That the person who'd built his company's financial systems could be discarded the moment they became inconvenient. So I did what any good CFO would do. I protected the shareholders from bad decision-making. Day 4 brought reporters to my front door. The story had leaked completely now. Fired CFO holding up billion-dollar merger. The press loved it. Corporate drama with clear heroes and villains. "Mr. Wallace, can you comment on why you're refusing to sign the merger authorization?" I gave them the same answer I'd given everyone else. Professional standards aren't negotiable. Never were, never will be. That evening, my phone rang. Diana Reynolds from Meridian Capital. "Mr. Wallace, we represent a consortium of investors interested in distressed corporate assets. We'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity with you." "What kind of opportunity?" "Senior financial advisor position. Full autonomy on due diligence decisions, equity participation, and most importantly, the professional respect your expertise deserves." I'd never heard of Meridian Capital, but a quick internet search was enlightening. They specialized in acquiring assets from companies whose management had made spectacularly poor decisions, companies whose stock prices had collapsed due to leadership failures, companies exactly like Apex Technologies. "I'll consider it," I said. Friday morning, deadline day. The moment Brian Hutchinson had been dreading for 4 days, and I'd been quietly anticipating. I woke up at my usual time, 6 o'clock a.m., 24 years of corporate habit doesn't disappear overnight, and made coffee in the strange quiet of having nowhere to be. No meetings to rush to, no reports to review, no Brian Hutchinson demanding updates on quarterly projections. Just me, my kitchen table, and the knowledge that by 5 o'clock p.m. today, a $3.8 billion empire would either stand or fall based on whether I picked up a pen. By 8 a.m., my phone was ringing non-stop. Lawyers, board members, even some Apex employees I'd hired and mentored over the years. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Would Thomas Wallace sign the authorization? I let them all go to voicemail. Around 10 o'clock a.m., something interesting happened. A courier showed up at my door with an overnight package. Inside was a formal letter from Atlantic Technologies themselves. Not their lawyers, not Apex's legal team, but the actual company Brian was trying to acquire. Mr. Wallace, the letter began, we recognize your critical role in ensuring the integrity of this transaction. Without your authorization, we cannot proceed. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss this matter directly. They were going around Brian entirely. Smart move. Why negotiate with a CEO who'd already proven he couldn't deliver what he'd promised? But the real surprise came at noon. A knock on my door, and standing there was Patricia Morrison, the board member who hadn't said a word during my execution 4 days earlier. Tom, can we talk? I invited her in, poured coffee, and waited to see what Apex's board of directors wanted to say now that their billion-dollar deal was falling apart. The board met in emergency session this morning, Patricia said, stirring sugar into her cup with nervous precision. We've reviewed the legal framework of the Atlantic acquisition. We understand the situation. What situation is that? You're the only person who can complete this merger, and Brian fired you. I nodded. That's an accurate summary. Patricia looked out my kitchen window at the city skyline, probably thinking about all those glass towers where Apex's competitors were watching the company implode in real time. The board is prepared to offer you immediate reinstatement, full CFO authority, 5-year contract, 30% salary increase. Interesting timing. Patricia, let me ask you something. If I sign this authorization today, what happens to me next week when Brian decides I'm still too cautious about his next big idea? She didn't have an answer for that because we both knew exactly what would happen. 6 months from now, maybe a year, Brian would find another reason to call me dead weight, and I'd be right back where I started. The board would protect you, she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. Like you protected me on Tuesday? After Patricia left, I sat at my kitchen table thinking about choices. Real choices. The kind that define who you are and what you stand for. I could sign the authorization, take the money, restore my reputation, go back to being Brian Hutchinson's cleanup crew, pretend the last week never happened, and hope he'd learned some kind of lesson about treating people with respect. Or I could do what 24 years of experience told me was right. Protect the shareholders from a risky acquisition that hadn't been properly vetted. Stand by the professional standards that had made me good at this job in the first place. At 4 o'clock p.m., my phone rang one last time. Brian himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom, please. You've proven your point. I was wrong to call you dead weight. You're not dead weight. You never were. Don't let this destroy what we built together. For just a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Brian, we didn't build this together. I built the financial systems. I managed the risks. I cleaned up the messes. You just took credit for the results. What do you want? Money, equity, a seat on the board? Just name it. I want something you can't give me. I want to work for people who value experience instead of dismissing it, who see caution as wisdom, not weakness, who understand that good financial management isn't about saying yes to everything, it's about knowing when to say no. The line went quiet. So you're really going to let the deadline pass? I looked at the clock. 4:47 p.m. Due diligence isn't negotiable, Brian. Never was, never will be. At 5 o'clock p.m., exactly, I was sitting on my couch, watching the financial news when the alert started flashing across the screen. Breaking, Apex Atlantic merger collapses. Stock in free fall after deal failure. CEO Brian Hutchinson unable to secure required authorization. Within an hour, the stock had dropped 35%. Trading was halted twice. Financial analysts were calling it one of the most spectacular corporate failures of the year. Apex's market valuation plummeted from $8.2 billion to to $5.3 billion in a single trading session. My phone rang. Diana Reynolds from Meridian Capital. Mr. Wallace, I assume you've seen the news. Our offer stands. In fact, given today's developments, we'd like to discuss expanding your role. What did you have in mind? Chief Financial Officer. Meridian is acquiring Apex's core technology assets from bankruptcy proceedings. We need someone who understands the real value of what they built. Someone who can spot the risks that others miss. 6 months later, I was back in corporate America. Different company, same expertise, but this time working for people who hired me specifically because I knew when to say no. Meridian Capital bought Apex's best assets for $1.8 billion, less than half of what Brian thought they were worth, and turned them into a profitable division within 18 months. Brian? Last I heard, he was working for a mid-level consulting firm in Phoenix, trying to rebuild a reputation that would never fully recover. The business world has a long memory, especially for leaders who spectacularly implode on live television. The funny thing is, none of this was really about revenge. It was about something simpler: professional integrity. After 24 years of making other people's aggressive strategies actually work, I finally said no to one that didn't make sense. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person refusing to go along, standing up and saying, "This doesn't pass the smell test, and I won't put my name on it." The clause I'd written 2 years earlier wasn't about power or control. It was about fiduciary responsibility, doing right by shareholders, employees, and everyone whose financial future depended on making smart decisions instead of fast ones. A year later, I received the Finance Executive Network's CFO of the Year award. The citation read, "For exemplifying the highest standards of professional integrity and fiduciary responsibility." Standing at that podium, looking out at 500 of my peers, I knew I'd made the right choice. Due diligence isn't negotiable, never was, never will be.